Welcome back to Palestine Bookshelf. I'm Stephen Heiner, and today we're going to be discussing The Revolution of 1936 to 1939 in Palestine by Ghassan Kanafani. Another one of these works. It's always shocking how much Kanafani was able to write in his very short life. It's a reminder to all of us to make good use of our time. I'm going to start talking about this by giving you some statistics that he gives us from this period, because if you're not familiar with this period during the British Mandate, you're not going to understand the conditions that led to the revolt. Between 1933 and 1935, 150,000 Jews immigrated to Palestine, growing the Jewish population to 443,000 people, about 30% of the total population. To appreciate these numbers, we should put them in perspective. The average yearly number of Jewish immigrants to Palestine in the 1926 to 1932 period was 7,201 people per year, and this had effectively mushroomed to 42,985 Jewish immigrants per year in the 1933 to 1936 period. The preponderance of specifically German Jews moving to Palestine in those years of the Nazi rise to power: 9,000 in 1932, 30,000 in 1933, 40,000 in 1934, and 61,000 in 1935. Almost three-quarters of the Jewish immigrants settled in Palestine's cities. Of the 2,562,000 Jews who managed to escape Nazi persecution between 1935 and 1943, the United States took in no more than 170,000. Britain took in 50,000. It was left to Palestine to absorb 8.5% of the total, while 75% of the German Jews took refuge in the Soviet Union. We can get a sense of the seismic shock experienced by the Arab Society of Palestine as a result of this migration by considering the proportion of the Jewish migrants who are capitalists: 11% in 1933, 12% in 1934, and 10% in 1935. Already by 1935, Jewish capital controlled 872 of 1,212 industrial firms in Palestine, employing 13,678 workers compared to the 4,000 employed by Arab capital. Jewish investment that year totaled 4,391,000 Palestinian pounds, with production valued at 6 million, compared to the 704,000 Palestinian pounds of Arab investment generating 545,000. Moreover, the British Mandate government awarded 90% of its concessions to the Jewish sector, which alone accounted for 5,789,000 of state investment, underwriting the employment of 2,619 workers. If you don't know what is meant by concessions, this is electricity, water, trash, all of the sorts of things that would generate employment and are long-term infrastructure connections. And that 90% went to one group. Does that show a bias? I don't know. You tell me. The official census of September 1937 shows that Jewish workers' wages were on average 145% higher than those of their Arab counterparts in that year. This was much higher in particular sectors. The wage differential was 433% for women workers in textiles, 233% for women workers in tobacco sorting, 84% for typesetters, and so on. The real wages of the Arab worker witnessed a 10% decrease between 1931 and September 1937, while the real wages of the Jewish worker rose 10% over the same period. And this is not necessarily the place to have a discussion about how the market works and the role of government intervention, but what is clear is that Britain intervened on the side of the Zionists, gave them access to all of the concessions, 90% of the concessions, and allowed them to propagate their idea of Jewish labor, kicking people who had lived on the land for centuries off the land so that only Jews could live there, and allowing this to spread. Resentment is going to come as a result of this. In addition to that, you're also going to make sure these people don't get educated. In his report of 1930, 13 years into the British occupation of Palestine, the Director of Education stated that since the beginning of the occupation, the government has never undertaken to provide sufficient funds for the building of a single school in the country. In 1935, the government rejected 41% of Arab applications for enrollment in schools. In 800 Arab villages in Palestine, there were only 269 boys' schools, 15 girls' schools, and 15 girls from the villages who made it to the 7th elementary grade. None of the villages had a secondary school, and 517 villages had no school at all. On top of this, the government censored books and worked against all cultural ties to the broader Arab world, while doing nothing to improve social conditions among the peasantry. In 1931, and as a consequence of these policies, those attending school among Palestinian Muslims were 251 per thousand males and 33 per thousand females, 715 per thousand males and 441 per thousand females among Palestinian Christians. So, and if you want to learn more about this, you can read One Palestine Complete by Tom Segev. I'll put a link to one of the reviews I did for that in the description, in which this idea is built out more, that the British admitted to the fact that if the Palestinians would be better educated, they would realize how terrible their situation was, and they would probably revolt. And so you can't educate people, you can't teach them how to read, you can't teach them about their history, because they'd find out how wretched they were being treated, how wretchedly they were being treated. So when we're looking at who was killed in the revolt, I don't think, because there's always a question of thousands of people killed. And so even in today's time, and every life matters, not just, it should matter to us as humans, but it matters in the eyes of God, who's created every single one of us. When you are able to overlay the Palestinian casualties on to numbers that we would recognize as moderns, then it will really hit with you. And that happens at the end of this paragraph. So listen to this. According to this study, 1,200 Arabs were killed in 1936, 120 in 1937, 1,200 in 1938, and 1,200 in 1939. The number of Arabs executed over the course of the revolution was 112, and a further 1,200 were killed in various terrorist operations. This adds up to 5,032 Arabs killed over the course of the 1936-39 revolution, while the number of those injured in the same period was 14,760. In terms of incarceration, there are around 816 prisoners in 1937, 2,463 in 1938, and 5,679 in 1939. The stark significance of these figures can be better appreciated through per capita comparison. If the same human casualties were proportionally inflicted upon British society, it would be the equivalent of 200,000 killed, 600,000 injured, and 1,224,000 prisoners. In terms of the United States population, and keep in mind he's talking at the time that he's writing this, so this would have been in the 60s. In terms of the United States population, this would be equivalent to 1 million killed, 3 million injured, and 6 million incarcerated. So once those numbers start to hit, you realize what a disaster 36 to 39 was for the Palestinians, and why they went into 1948 demoralized and way behind. A lot of their finest and best leaders had been killed, and a lot of the young men who were willing to fight, even before there was, you could say, a state to fight for, even though they didn't have good leaders. This is what happened. And I'm going to repeat these numbers. In terms of the United States population, this would be equivalent to 1 million killed, 3 million injured, and 6 million incarcerated. So when you realize that, you start to understand what we're talking about when it comes to the Arab Revolt 36 to 39 and why it's so important to understand it. Let's talk about some of the other issues that were going on. George Mansour presented the Peel Commission with an astounding sense of Palestinian workers' lived experience. By the end of 1935, Jaffa alone had 2,270 unemployed male and female workers, a very large number for a city of 71,000 people. Mansour identified 5 key factors underpinning the high unemployment rate, 4 of which were inseparable from Zionist immigration. 1. The economic effects of the immigration itself. 2. The growing pressures on peasants to move to the cities. 3. Dismissal of Arab workers from waged work. 4. The overall deterioration in economic conditions. And 5. The government's flagrant discrimination in favor of Jewish workers. This isn't necessarily a question of blaming the immigrants for everything. There are times in which there are other forces going on that cause economic problems, but in this particular case, everything's directly tied to it. So economic effects of the immigration itself, you have all of these people coming into the country. The peasants moving to the cities, this is because the Jewish National Fund was buying land and then expelling the people who lived there, who had been there, effectively worked as serfs for centuries and had the right to work on the land. And the Jews didn't want that. They only wanted Jewish labor, and they didn't want anything to do with you horrible Arabs. Get out of here. Well, then these people come to the cities, and there the Jews not only agitate with the British, but among themselves to pay higher wages to their people so that they'll have more money to then drive them further out. Dismissal of Arab workers from waged work. So even when you did have Arabs working for Jews, they were encouraged by the Histrodute and other forces in Jewry to get rid of their Arab workers. So even the Arabs who were at a regular job, they would get fired for not being Jewish. Overall deterioration in economic conditions, and then the government's flagrant discrimination. The British coming in, making sure that the concessions went to the Jews, the police jobs went to the Jews, the government jobs went to the Jews, and then these sorts of problems exacerbate. The Histrodrut offers a clear formulation of the reality. To allow the Arabs access to the Jewish labor market would mean that Jewish capital would be directed toward Arab development and against Zionist objectives. We cannot allow the Arabs to develop. They're not allowed to be human beings. We can only employ our own people. Moreover, employment of Arabs in Jewish industry will lead to class divisions in Palestine along racial lines, Jews as capitalists using Arabs as laborers. We would thereby recreate in Palestine the same unnatural conditions that led to the emergence of anti-Semitism in the diaspora. That's it. We're going to blame it on that. Jewish organizations' land ownership rose at the expense of both rural and urban property, from 300,000 dunams in 1929 to 1.25 million dunams in 1930. Though these 100,000 hectares were insignificant from the perspective of the mass colonization project, let alone the, quote, solution to the Jewish question, the expropriation of around 1 million dunams, about one-third of the arable land, entailed the impoverishment of the peasants and the Bedouin at an unprecedented scale and rate. The Zionists had expelled 20,000 peasant families by 1931. The key point here is that in addition to this systematic impoverishment, this immiseration was unmistakably being carried out along primarily national lines. The agrarian in the underdeveloped world generally, and in the Arab world in particular, is not only a mode of production, but also the deep-rooted social, religious, and ritualistic way of life. And what Kanafani is pointing to here is you can't just point and say that person is a farm worker. Everything around them relates to that. And if you want to just kick someone out, you're not just taking away their job, you're taking away everything. And you cannot do this to 20,000 families without having a major effect on the society. And the idea is, if you're going to come in and share the land, that's one thing, but you're going to come in and dominate the land, kick everybody out, make things pleasant, unpleasant, and make them want to leave. That was always the goal. So you don't have to have weapons and 1948 and an expulsion to hurt people. You can start expelling people in the 30s, and that's what they were doing. As the Arab peasant suffered the triple nightmare of Zionist colonization of the land, Arab feudal land ownership, and the exorbitant taxation levied by the British Mandate government, the challenge that took center stage was the national one. In the intifadas of August 1929 and 1933, many of the Arab smallholders sold their lands to the large Arab landowners to buy weapons with which to fight Zionist colonization and British occupation. Colonialism, which threatened a way of life that encompassed aspects of religion, tradition, and honor, enabled the feudal cleric leaders to hold on to their positions of social leadership despite the crimes they continued to commit. In many cases, those same feudal elements buying the land from the smallholders went on to sell it to Jewish capital. This is a betrayal that many people point to that a lot of people don't understand. That these people who are the so-called leaders of some aspects of the Palestinian national movement were secretly selling land to the Jews, and that also, the Jews led them to despise the Palestinians. So that if you really loved your land and you really loved your country, why would you sell it to me? You know what I'm trying to do. So the Jews looked at that and said, well, that's how Palestinians are. They'll do anything to sell out their people. And that impression has come down to the present day among Zionists. They still think this way about the Palestinians, and unfortunately, there's some evidence for them to think that way. Then there's also expulsions. We think of the settlements today and the violence that's happening that's leading to expulsions. This was happening in the 30s. Many other such cases in which the Jewish settlers seized the lands and dispersed the Arab inhabitants. The result was that 50,000 Jews living in agricultural settlements owned 1.2 million dunams, an average of 24 dunams per inhabitant. Arab peasants, in contrast, numbered 500,000 and owned less than 6 million dunams, averaging 12 dunams per inhabitant. Another instance was that of the 8,730 peasants evicted from Marj ibn Amr, which was 240,000 dunams, which was sold by the Beiruti feudal Sursuk family. The peasants' formal attempts to reclaim their land remained suspended between the offices of the Mandate government from the conclusion of the land deal in 1921 until the Mandate's end in 1948. Can you imagine having your case caught up for 20 plus years? This is the sort of thing that was going on, and I promise you, if there had been a Jewish family or Jewish peasants going at it, they wouldn't have made them wait 20 years. The Mandate had its priorities, and the priorities were Jewish priorities. The land purchases created a fast-growing class of landless peasants who could only eke out a living in the countryside from seasonal waged agricultural work. As a result, most of them headed for the cities, where they became cheap, unskilled labor. There was no case in which a peasant removed from his land went on to secure another plot of land, not a single one. Compensation was most often very meager and only generous when it was the village mukhtar or its notables. The vast majority moved to the cities. Abject poverty, crushing oppression, and centuries of class and national repression combined to establish the perfect system for defeatism, fatalism, and political quietism that was reflected in the most widespread popular proverbs and sayings. What you have to understand about proverbs and sayings, which I'm sure you do in your own culture, in your own language, is they say so much about a people. They say so much about your priorities, your traditions, the way that you think. And what he's gathered here in the footnote, and I might read all of them, but what you'll think about when you think about the implication, because they're not going to be familiar proverbs to you, so you'll have to stop and think about them for a moment. But there's a real sense of defeatism, quietism, suppression, submission. Part of it, I think, a learned helplessness in a way. They didn't see a way out. There wasn't an obvious fix to the situation. The government was against them. The Jews were against them. Their own leaders were not really helping them. And so these kinds of proverbs eventuate. He who eats from the Sultan's bread can strike with his sword. If you have a penny, you can make a penny. A good bribe loosens a bad judge's purse strings. The mettle of men is in the lies they can tell. 1,000 setbacks are better than a defeat. The only grass that matters is the grass on my side of the fence. An egg today is better than a chicken tomorrow. Put your head with all the others before you tempt the headsman. Don't stretch your toes beyond your blanket. The prince's dog is a prince. Rice gets the glory and bulgur can go hang itself. Move into the coffin business and people will stop dying. The worst of the pain is the pain right now. If you can't beat them, join them. He runs after the loaf and the loaf just races ahead. The world stands with the one standing. Only God decides on life and livelihood. A person in need is a burden. We were so poor the spit on the ground looked like a shilling. The eye does not rise above the brow. I'm the first to comply and the last to rebel. Now, these were proverbs that were in place in the 30s in Palestine. And I am certain that some of them have actually continued into current Palestinian usage today. I'd be curious, and if you are Palestinian, you're watching this review, or you know any, please let me know if any of these sayings are still in use to this day. And if they're not, I would be really interested in that as well. But what he's doing here, what Kanafani is doing is laying the groundwork, explaining to us how did we get to a situation like this. He gives us the economic factors, he gives us statistics, he explains the frustration, and in some sense the fatalism, the defeatism that we would hear among the peasantry. But also we're going to start to hear frustration from the intellectuals. In the meantime, if you watched the video so far, consider hitting like, subscribe, and it's a free way for you to support the channel, and it also helps other people get to know our work who might not otherwise do that. So please consider liking or subscribing. So here's some of the poetry that starts to develop. If only a leader of ours would fast, like Gandhi, for his fast might do good. He won't abstain from food. In Palestine, a leader dies if it weren't for his food. May he fast from selling land, a spot he can save to rest his bones. What is that poem telling you? The poem is telling you there is starting to be frustration about Palestinians selling lands to the Jews. And say, you better not sell some land so you have some place to bury yourself. Because there might not be a place to bury yourself. Here's another one. They sold the country, greedy for gold, but it was their homeland that they sold. They'd be forgiven had they been forced by hunger, but by God they have not thirsted a day nor hungered. It's not the poor people who are selling, it's the rich. And the Palestinian people knew this and are starting to express their frustration. And here's where it gets really, where the frustration is a boiling point. Let's just listen to the anger in this poem. You, Arab, son of an impoverished mother, sell your mother and buy a gun. A rifle is better than your mother. On Revolution Day, it will relieve you of your woes. Think about the shift in consciousness for that to happen in a society that is so attached to mothers, that is so respectful of the family, that you'd articulate something like sell your mother and buy a gun. Because you'll need that on Revolution Day. What kind of frustration has to exist in a society to produce poetry like that? And obviously, poetry isn't representative of the whole society, but it is representative of ideas that are percolating throughout society. Journalism, literary essays, stories, and the translation movement collectively played a very significant leadership role. For example, the opening editorial published by Yusuf al-Isa in a 1920 issue of Al-Nafais stated, Palestine is Arab, Arab through its Muslims, Arab through its Christians, Arab in its patriotic Jews. On what basis does the Zionist foreigner sell it off? The storms of Palestine will not quiet if it is severed from Syria and rendered a national home for Zionism. So here in 1920, he's saying that Palestine is Arab through its Muslims, through its Christians, and through its patriotic Jews. So this idea that, Jews and Muslims always hated each other, this guy, Yusuf al-Isa, is articulating the existence of Palestine as necessarily Muslim, Christian, and Jewish, living together, ideally in peace. And they were living in peace prior to the arrival of the Zionists. So up to this point, we've been alluding to, Kanafani has been alluding to the revolt. So now we're going to talk about the revolt, we're going to talk about the repression, we're going to talk about the consequences. And as always with these book reviews, I can only glide over some of it. I'm trying to encourage you to read it. In this particular case, it's not very long, talking about maybe 60, 80 pages. There's a foreword, there's an afterword, glossary, and some other content, but it's well worth your time. For me, I mean, anything that Kanafani writes, I'm interested in, because I really feel that he was doing the work at a time in which he had the memory of expulsion himself, and he was able to get to some primary sources which might now be locked up by the Israelis, which cannot be accessed. According to some, the initial spark was an ambush carried out by a group of Arab militants who held up and robbed the Jewish and Arab passengers of 15 vehicles traveling between Anabta and Nur Shams. According to one of the militants, a short speech was given to the passengers, the majority of whom were Arab, in which he proclaimed that the revolution had begun and we are taking your money so we can fight the enemy and defend you. All sources concur, however, that the beginning of the revolution lay in the intifada led by Sheikh Izz al-Din al-Qassam, the al-Qassam which we know today, the al-Qassam Brigades. The Peel Commission report, which Bauer considers among the most reliable sources on the Palestine question, glides over particular trigger events by giving two principal causes for the eruption of the uprising: the Arabs' desire for national independence and their antipathy and concern toward the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine. We can see these two causes are, in fact, one and the same, despite their vague and nebulous phrasing. Opinions may differ on al-Qassam as a thinker, but there can be no doubt whatsoever that the Qassamist movement was a turning point in its adoption of an advanced form of struggle. By doing so, the Qassamists put the fragmented and scattered traditional Palestinian leaders to the test, a test they could no longer avoid. According to one well-known Qassamist, al-Qassam devised his strategy as one that would unfold in 4 stages. First, psychological preparation and spreading revolutionary spirit. Second, the establishment of secret groups. Third, the formation of committees, each with a particular task such as collecting donations, purchasing arms, military training, security and espionage, propaganda and information, and political communications. Fourth, armed revolt. Despite the meddlesome fight al-Qassam and his men put up, the British troops they encountered easily overpowered them. It seems that when Sheikh al-Qassam realized he and his comrades would not be able to continue to mobilize for the revolution, he raised a new slogan: "Die in battle as martyrs." We would do justice to al-Qassam to take this last slogan as expressing of a kind of Guevara-esque heroism. The few first-person testimonies of al-Qassam that we do have, however, suggest that he appreciated the significance of the role he himself played as the explosive force fueling a forward revolutionary foco. In this case, foco is just this term of cadres, group of people working together for a specific aim. The effect was immediate. Masses of people came to walk in the 10-kilometer burial procession to the village of Yajur. What is most significant about this moment is that it exposed the traditional leaders to the challenge of everything Sheikh al-Qassam represented, a challenge that leadership felt just as acutely as the British Mandate authorities. And it also is a reminder, and I'll talk about this at the end of the review, studying this has just made me feel like I'm stuck in a cycle of action that happens in Palestine over and over, because as usual you have a movement which then the leadership tries to capitalize on, but they were not the ones leading the movement. From an organizational standpoint, the Palestinian nationalist movement was effectively comprised of political parties that were by and large the remaining sediments of the movements that had formed against the Ottoman Empire in the early 1900s. On the one hand, this meant that these formations, unlike their counterparts in Egypt, had little to no experience sustaining an independent struggle. What it also meant was that these were effectively vacuous formations, lacking any specific principles per se. Rather, they were groupings headed by gangs of notables that depended on the loyalties those notables could garner on the basis of their status-based influence as clerics, landowners, or clan patriarchs. In no way can we think of them as political factions with organized cadre and popular support bases. With the important exception of al-Qassam himself, and of course the communists, not one of the leaders of the Palestinian national movement at this time was armed with a strategic organizational mind. Though he possessed rare administrative capabilities, Haj Amin al-Husseini was a far cry from the kind of leader who could conceive and carry out a sustained organized struggle. The burden of organizational work remained mostly confined to individuals at the level of subcommittees and mid-level cadre who could not codify or institutionalize their talents. The revolt goes on. The British get more and more brutal in their repression, and keep in mind, at this point in the late 1930s, they have really perfected the ability to crush colonialist uprisings. They, with their vast colonial experience, the British know how to put down people who dare to want to rule themselves. The movement leadership's positioning was clear from the outset. It saw the mass popular uprising as a mere tool with which to apply pressure on the British colonial authorities to advance the leaders' own class interests. The British were profoundly aware of this and acted accordingly. Despite this, the British did not deign to go to any extra lengths to make any of the concessions that class sought. This would be the ruling class. London dug in its heels, insisted upon fulfilling its commitment to hand over the mantle of the colonizer to the Zionist movement. To the contrary, the years of the Revolution, 1936 to 1939, were a period in which British colonialism threw its weight behind the goal of solidifying the Zionist presence and standing it on its feet, as we will see further on. The British employed two means to bring about this goal. First, by striking at the impoverished peasant revolutionaries with unparalleled violence, and second, by using their extensive influence with the Arab regimes that ultimately played a major role in pacifying the revolt. Al-Sifri gives a list of sentences issued at the time to exemplify the repressiveness of the regulations. 6-year prison sentences for possession of a firearm, 12 years for possession of a bomb, 5 years hard labor for possession of 12 rounds of ammunition, 8 months for giving a group of British soldiers wrong directions, 9 years for the possession of small explosives, 5 years for attempting to buy ammunition from soldiers, 2 weeks for possession of a stick, etc. The British also adopted a policy of wide-scale home demolition. On June the 18th, 1936, British authorities blew up and destroyed a large part of the city of Jaffa, with an estimated 220 homes demolished and around 6,000 people forced out of their homes. In addition to this, in the suburbs surrounding Jaffa, they destroyed 100 huts in Al-Jabalia, 300 in Abu Kabir, 250 in Al-Sheikh Murad, and 75 in Arab al-Dawoodi. It is evident that the inhabitants of the Jaffa neighborhoods and outskirts whose homes were destroyed were poor peasants who had moved to the towns from the countryside. As for the villages, Al-Sifri counted 143 homes razed under pretext directly related to the revolution. These homes belonged to poor peasants, some medium peasants, and a very small number of feudal land-owning families. Home demolitions in Palestine were not invented by the Zionists. The Zionists were taught how to do this by the British. So, we alluded to the fact that the Arab monarchs would play a role in suppressing the revolt. On October the 11th, 1936, the Arab Higher Committee distributed a communique calling for the end of the general strike and, by extension, the revolution. It stated, "Whereas submission to the will of their Majesties and Highnesses, the Arab kings, and compliance with their wishes is one of our inherited Arab traditions, and given that the Arab Higher Committee firmly believes that their Majesties and Highnesses would not command their sons to take any, but the actions that would be in the people's interests, and with the purpose of protecting their rights, the Arab Higher Committee has, in obedience to the will of their Majesties and Highnesses, the kings and princes, and stemming from its belief in the great benefit that will result from their mediation and support, calls on the noble Arab people to end the strike and strife pursuant to these noble orders, who have no object but the interest of the Arabs." So, who are we talking about? Saudi Arabia, Transjordan, people who already have their own deals with the colonizers, being told, hey, why don't you calm these Palestinians down? They're making a big ruckus. You scratch my back, I scratch yours. These leaders say, we'll work on your behalf. Don't worry about it. Leave it with us. And these people, already brutally repressed, but being told by other Arabs, like, we're going to take care of it, they lay down their arms. And do those Arab monarchs actually do anything for them? Not in the 1930s, not in the 1940s, not in the 1950s, not in the 1960s, and yes, not in 2025 either. Why? Because it's not really their cause. They have their own problems with their own population. They pay lip service to the Palestinians, but evidence over and over is people want to extract a deal for their people and leave the Palestinians to themselves. From this time to now, that's the story. It's not something to like, but it's the reality, and Kanafani was telling this in the 1950s and the 1960s. The killing of Abd al-Rahim al-Hajj Muhammad in March 1939 came as a crushing blow. The revolution had lost one of its most popular, revolutionary, courageous, wise, and sincere commanders. In the wake of his martyrdom, the network of local commanders began to unravel, many of them leaving the battlefield altogether. The world was closing in on the revolutionaries, and the warming of ties between the British and the French on the eve of the World War was yet another step in the isolation of the revolution. Worn out by hunger in the wilderness, Arif Abd al-Razek and some of his troop members surrendered to French forces. At around the same time, Transjordanian forces arrested Yusuf Abu Duda and handed him over to the British, who executed him. The collective punishment of villagers led them to fear British reprisal for supporting the guerrillas by, for example, providing them food and ammunition. The problems the revolution had with regards its own leadership meant that the minimum level of organization needed to tackle such challenges was no longer in place. To this, we can also add two more interconnected factors of key importance in bringing the revolt to an end. The first of these was the role played by Transjordan, as then represented by the collaborationist regime of Prince Abdullah. The second was the role played by the agents of counter-revolution inside Palestine, alongside the terrorism of the British and Zionist forces. The way these two factors were interwoven enables us to discuss them simultaneously. The Defense Party, led by Ragheb al-Nashashibi, was effectively the agent of the collaborationist Transjordanian regime within the Palestinian national movement. Nashashibi's overt connection to Amman camouflaged the party's more fundamental role as an agent of the British colonizer, an important deception given that this was taking place in the heat of a battle directed primarily at that same British colonizer. As such, the ruse of a primary loyalty to Transjordan was acceptable both to Amman and to London. The party was basically a small grouping of urban effendis, primarily representing the interest of the emergent comprador bourgeoisie, which had begun to reveal that the strings behind its presence and growth were in the hands not only of British colonialism, but of the Zionist movement that controlled the Palestinian economy's industrial transformation. This positionality in the class structure is what enables a summation of the party leadership as follows. They collaborated with the British occupation on an administrative level, with the Zionists on a commercial level. They sold land to the Jews and acted as their agents, sowed social divisions and impeded patriotic activity. They made themselves the link between the Hashemites and the Zionists in 1923 to 24. They supported the waves of immigration and the Mandate regime throughout the 1920s and supported partition in the 1930s. They called for a Jewish national home to be established on one part of Palestine and for handing over the remaining part to Transjordan. And if that's hurtful to hear or to read as a non-Palestinian, imagine how hurtful it is to write it as a Palestinian, which is what Kanafani did. And he didn't try to hide it. He didn't try to cover it over. He said, we were betrayed by our own people within the movement, people who pretended to be our friends, but really were sellouts to the Jordanians and to the Zionists. To this day, that's still going on. The PA is effectively the sellout of the Palestinians to the Zionists. They're happy to take their salary, their family's taken care of. Who cares about the resistance struggle? Who cares about the future? They care about their paycheck. So this is a straight line that between the collaborationists with the Jordanians in the 30s to the Palestinian Authority in the present day. The interplay of the two tenets of Zionist strategy in this period, alliance with the British to the greatest extent possible, and mobilization of the Jewish settler community in Palestine, had devastating consequences. The Jewish bourgeoisie took advantage of the Arab Revolution's escalation to put projects in place that would not have been possible under different circumstances. Finding itself suddenly free of the competition from cheap Arab agricultural produce, this bourgeoisie set out to entrench and develop its economic presence. Naturally, this would have been impossible without the blessing of the British. Over the course of the revolution, the Zionists and the Mandate authorities succeeded in building a network of roads connecting the Jewish settlement colonies to one another and to the major cities. This road network would later form a keystone of Zionist economic infrastructure. Ports played a central role in this infrastructure. The road connecting Haifa and Tel Aviv was paved, the Haifa port was expanded and deepened, and a new port was built in Tel Aviv that would eventually extinguish the vitality of the main Arab port in Jaffa. Moreover, the Zionists had a de facto monopoly on the lucrative contracts for provisioning the British troops flooding into Palestine. Between 1936 and 1939, the Zionists established 50 settlement colonies. In the period between 1936 and 1938, Jewish investment in construction was $1,268,000 for works in 5 Jewish towns, while Arab investment in the same period was no more than $120,000 for works in 16 Arab towns. Jewish capital and labor devoted themselves to British security projects aimed at encircling and isolating the Arab Revolution. And I would add as a footnote to this, we've heard about Charles Ord Wingate from Benny Morris, from Tom Segev, from Ilan Pappé. He's someone that you have to understand because he is in many ways the founder of Jewish terrorism and the IDF. He had a great hatred for Arabs, and he taught this brutality and the way to exercise this brutality to the early Jewish supernumerary police force, which would then become the core of the Haganah, which would then become the core of the IDF. So Charles Ord Wingate is a godfather within the IDF. And he was not a Jew. He was just this really cruel British soldier. In this vein, it was the British officer Charles Ord Wingate who played a particularly prominent role in translating the British Zionist alliance into a pragmatic reality. Though Zionist historians have tried to intimate that Wingate's efforts were the result of an idiosyncratic temperament combined with an idealistic devotion to the Zionist cause, it is actually quite clear that this British military intelligence officer was sent by his chiefs to Haifa in the autumn of 1937 with a very specific mission. The armed Jewish strike force had been established at least 6 months prior, but still needed preparation and development. Wingate's task was to set this enhancement of Zionist military capacity in motion. Widely considered by Israeli military figures as the true founder of the Israeli army, Captain Wingate made it his primary mission to safeguard the oil pipeline. But this mission soon expanded to a series of murderous terrorist raids on Arab communities that this British officer zealously took upon himself to teach his pupils at Indur, Moshe Dayan among them, to perfect. There is no doubt that in addition to his competence as a seasoned imperial officer, Wingate was armed with boundless, racist hatred of Arabs. His biography, as related by those who worked with him, suggests that he took great pleasure in killing, torturing, and degrading Arab peasants. In his study of Yigal Allon's History of the Israeli Military, Emil Tuma confirms that Wingate and his coterie of brutes systematically worked to aid British forces by terrorizing the Arab inhabitants of the rural areas during the 1936 to 1939 revolution. Again, the Zionists didn't even invent this terrorism. They were taught it by the British. So this idea that the Zionists are the source of all this evil themselves, no, they're not that original. They got it from Wingate. They got it from the British. They were taught these things. And as I alluded to, one of the things that felt discouraging to me at the end of the text, although I was encouraged by how much I'd learned and once again being taught by Kanafani about his country, is there's a cycle that we're seeing here. Israelis get imperial help. Palestinians are deprived of property and education and opportunity. The Palestinians get frustrated and they fight back. The Palestinians get brutally repressed. In this repression, Arab countries cooperate and betray. There's fractured leadership within the Palestinians and murder of existing leadership. The cycle begins again. The Israelis get imperial help. Palestinians are deprived of property and education and opportunity. The Palestinians are frustrated and they fight back. The Palestinians are brutally repressed and murdered. And the Arab countries are complicit. How will we get out of the cycle? When will we get out of the cycle? I don't know. But it is not new. It's not something that came up recently. It's something that has been happening in this land for a century and more. And one of the ways that we can help the Palestinians fight this is by making sure that we understand what's going on ourselves so that we can aid and assist, however that may be, in whatever way that's possible for you. One of the ways that you can support what we're doing here is by buying a copy of the book. There's a link in the description. And a free way that you can support the channel is by hitting like or subscribe, sharing this review with people who are open-minded enough to listen to what's actually going on in Palestine, as opposed to what the mainstream media will tell you. If you'd like to thank me for this video particularly, there's a link to PayPal and Buy Me a Coffee. You can send something that way. If you'd like to support the work on an ongoing basis, there's a link to Patreon, YouTube membership below. And if you'd like to nominate a book for a future review, there's a link to my Amazon wish list in the description. Pick something out from there. Obviously, there'll be books related to Palestine, and you'll see books that are not at all related to Palestine. Those are for my main Stephen Heiner channel if you want to check that out as well. But you can buy a book for me, send it my way, and that way you're actually nominating the book and sponsoring the video in a way, and I will try to get to it as soon as I can. Reminder that when this channel is monetized, and one of the ways you can help it get monetized by watching as many videos as you can and sharing it, is the Palestine Children's Relief Fund. That when this channel is monetized, the profits that we have are going to go to them. In the meantime, we encourage people to contribute. I contribute personally myself, even though the channel is running at a loss at the moment. And the Palestine Children's Relief Fund helps Palestinian children get medical care who could not otherwise get it. They're doing wonderful work. Please consider supporting them directly or support them indirectly by helping our channel. Until next time, enjoy your reading.